Let me be direct with you. There was no ceasefire. Let me be direct with you. There was no ceasefire. What you witnessed was a press release dressed up as diplomacy. And if you believe the United States government was ever serious about ending the conflict with Iran, you have fundamentally misunderstood how American power actually works. What I'm going to show you in the next 30 minutes is the complete financial and military architecture behind what is called Middle East policy. And I want you to understand from the outset that what looks like chaos, what looks like failed diplomacy, what looks like a humanitarian catastrophe is in fact a system operating exactly as designed. Stay with me, because by the time we are finished, you will never read a headline about the Middle East the same way again. Let me start with the foundational fact that almost no mainstream commentator will say out loud.
Whispers, the United States does not make foreign policy. It makes financial policy with military enforcement attached. Everything else, the rhetoric about democracy, the hand-wringing about human rights, the solemn declarations about international law, is the decorative layer applied on top of a set of financial imperatives that have remained essentially unchanged since the end of World War II. I know this not only from my decades of research, but from my direct experience. When I was working at Chase Manhattan Bank in the 1960s, I was assigned to analyze the balance of payments of the United States. What I discovered then, and what I elaborated in Super Imperialism in 1972, is that the United States had stumbled onto the most extraordinary free lunch in the history of international finance. It had figured out how to make the rest of the world pay for its own military domination. Here is the mechanism, and I want you to follow this carefully because everything that is happening in Iran, in Gaza, in Syria, in Yemen flows directly from this one structural reality. When the United States runs a military operation anywhere in the world, it spends dollars. Those dollars flow out of the United States into the economies of the countries where the military is operating, and also into the accounts of the defense contractors who supply the weapons, the logistics companies, the private military firms. Now, here is the part that is never taught in any economics course I am aware of. Those dollars, once they are spent, have to go somewhere. And where they go overwhelmingly is back into the United States Treasury in the form of purchases of US government bonds. This is what I call the dollar treasury bill standard. The world is forced to hold its reserves in dollars, and the primary vehicle for holding dollars is US Treasury debt, which means that every time the United States spends money on war, it is essentially issuing an invoice to the rest of the world, and the rest of the world has no choice but to pay it. That is not a metaphor. That is the actual financial mechanism that has governed the global economy since 1971, when Nixon closed the gold window and the dollar became a pure fiat currency backed by nothing except American military power and the requirement that oil be priced in dollars.
Now let us talk about oil, because this is the nerve center of the entire system. In 1974, Henry Kissinger negotiated an agreement with Saudi Arabia that would define the next half century of geopolitics. The details of that agreement were remarkably simple. The United States would guarantee the security of the Saudi royal family, protect them from internal rebellion, from regional rivals, from anyone who threatened the House of Saud. In exchange, Saudi Arabia would price all of its oil exports exclusively in US dollars. And it would recycle its oil revenues, the petrodollars, back into US Treasury bonds and US weapons purchases.
Curious. This agreement was then extended formally and informally across the Gulf states. And because Saudi Arabia was the swing producer in OPEC, and because the rest of OPEC followed Saudi pricing conventions, this effectively meant that any country in the world that wanted to buy oil, and every industrial economy needs oil, had to first acquire US dollars, which meant every country in the world was permanently in the business of generating dollar-denominated export earnings, which meant the United States had a guaranteed structural permanent demand for its currency, regardless of how irresponsibly it managed its own economy. Keep watching, because what I'm about to explain is the mechanism they have worked the hardest to keep out of public discussion. And it is the direct reason Iran has been in American crosshairs for the last 4 decades. What happens when a country tries to exit this system? What happens when a government decides it wants to price its oil in euros or in its own currency, or in a basket of currencies that does not include the dollar. Saddam Hussein tried this in 2000. He announced that Iraq would price its oil in euros. Within 3 years, Iraq was invaded, Saddam was deposed, and Iraqi oil was back on the dollar standard within months of the US occupation. Muammar Gaddafi tried something far more ambitious. He proposed a pan-African gold dinar that would allow African oil-producing nations to price their exports in a gold-backed currency, breaking free of both the dollar and the euro. In 2011, NATO intervened in the Libyan civil war. Gaddafi was murdered. Libya, which had been the most prosperous country in Africa by most measures of human development, was reduced to a failed state with open-air slave markets. These are not coincidences. These are data points in a very clear pattern. Iran's offense is not its nuclear program. I want to be very clear about this because the nuclear framing is one of the most successful propaganda achievements in modern American media history. Iran's actual offense is threefold. First, Iran has been a leading advocate for pricing oil in non-dollar currencies, and it has actually done so in many of its bilateral trading relationships, particularly with China, India, and Russia. Second, Iran is a central node in the emerging multipolar economic architecture, the BRICS system, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the network of bilateral currency swap agreements that China has been building for the past 15 years. That represents the first serious structural challenge to dollar hegemony since Bretton Woods. Third, Iran has demonstrated over 45 years of sanctions that it is possible to survive and even develop economically outside the dollar system. That demonstration effect is extraordinarily dangerous to American financial power because if Iran can do it, other countries will try. And if enough countries try, the dollar treasury bill standard begins to crack.
This is why the ceasefire is a lie. Not because American diplomats are uniquely dishonest, though some of them certainly are, but because a genuine stable peace with Iran would remove the primary justification for the American military presence in the Persian Gulf. And the American military presence in the Persian Gulf is what enforces the petrodollar system. It is the gun behind the dollar. Remove the gun, and suddenly the world central banks have a genuine choice about what currency to hold their reserves in. And if they have a genuine choice, many of them will choose something other than the dollar, because holding dollars means subsidizing American military spending and American financial extraction. No rational treasury minister acting in the interests of his own country would choose that if there were a real alternative available. The entire purpose of Middle East instability, and I use the word purpose deliberately, not accidentally, is to ensure that no real alternative is ever allowed to stabilize and consolidate. But if you think the petrodollar story is the whole picture, stay with me, because what I haven't shown you yet is the domestic side of this equation, the American institutions that have a direct financial stake in permanent war, and the way they have captured the policy process so completely that the question of peace is not even a permissible option within the Washington consensus. Let us talk about arms sales, because this is perhaps the most underappreciated dimension of what I have been calling military Keynesianism. The United States is the world's largest arms exporter by an enormous margin.
In recent years, American arms exports have accounted for somewhere between 40 and 50% of total global arms transfers. The primary customers for American weapons are concentrated in two regions, the Gulf states of the Middle East and the NATO alliance in Europe. Now, here is what mainstream economists consistently fail to point out about this. Arms exports are not like other exports. When Boeing sells a commercial aircraft to Singapore Airlines gets an aircraft that generates productive economic activity. It carries passengers, it generates revenue, it depreciates over time, and is eventually replaced. When Raytheon sells a Patriot missile battery to Saudi Arabia gets a weapons system that does one of two things. Either it sits in a warehouse and depreciates, generating no economic return whatsoever, or it is used, in which case it is destroyed, and Saudi Arabia needs to buy another one. Arms exports are, from the perspective of the purchasing country, pure consumption. They generate no productive capacity. They create no lasting wealth. They are the most expensive and least productive form of import any economy can engage in.
But from the perspective of the American defense contractor and from the perspective of the US balance of payments, they are extraordinarily valuable. Every Patriot battery sold to Saudi Arabia, every F-35 sold to the UAE, every HIMARS system sold to any of a dozen client states represents a dollar inflow to the American defense industrial base. And crucially, those sales are frequently financed, meaning the purchasing country takes on dollar denominated debt to buy American weapons, which means the arms sales simultaneously strengthens the American industrial base, generates returns for American financial institutions that arrange the financing, and increases the dollar denominated debt burden of the purchasing country, tying it ever more firmly into the dollar system.
Pause. Now think about what this means for the structural incentives of American foreign policy. Every time there is a crisis in the Middle East, every time Iran fires a missile, every time a Houthi drone strikes a Saudi oil facility, every time Israel conducts an operation in Gaza that triggers a regional escalation, Gulf state military procurement goes up. The phone calls from Riyadh and Abu Dhabi to Lockheed Martin and Raytheon happen within days. Orders are placed, contracts are signed. Congressmen in the districts where those weapons are manufactured take note. The defense industry's campaign contributions flow accordingly. This is not a conspiracy. It does not require anyone to sit in a room and plan it. It is simply the structural logic of an economy that has organized a significant portion of its industrial base around the production and export of weapons, and that has created a client state system in the Middle East that is permanently insecure and therefore permanently in the market for more weapons. And here is what I want you to hold in your mind as we go into the analysis, the question that should be keeping every serious economist awake at night. The BRICS expansion of 2023 and 2024, the inclusion of Saudi Arabia, Iran, the UAE, Egypt, and Ethiopia into that grouping, represents something that the architects of the petrodollar system never anticipated. For the first time since 1974, there is a credible framework within which major oil-producing states could coordinate a move away from dollar pricing. Saudi Arabia has already begun accepting yuan for Chinese oil purchases. Iran has been trading in yuan and rubles for years. The infrastructure for a non-dollar oil market is being built quietly, transaction by transaction, swap line by swap line, and the United States is watching it happen with a combination of denial and escalating panic. The ceasefire with Iran, if it ever materializes in any meaningful form, will not be a peace agreement. It will be a tactical pause, a repositioning move in a much longer game. And the question of what happens to the dollar, to American financial dominance, and to the 80-year architecture of American empire when that game finally reaches its conclusion, that is the question we are going to answer. Do not go anywhere.
What I left you with at a question, and I want to return to it immediately because it is the organizing question of everything that follows. The BRICS expansion has created, for the first time in 50 years, a structural alternative to the dollar system. The question is not whether the United States understands this. It does. The question is what it is willing to do to prevent it. And the answer to that question is everything. Absolutely everything, including the permanent destabilization of the Middle East, including proxy wars, including the weaponization of sanctions, including the deliberate destruction of any regional economy that shows signs of integrating into the emerging multipolar order. What you are watching in Iran, in Gaza, in Syria, in Yemen is not foreign policy failure. It is foreign policy success, measured by the only metric that actually matters to the financial architecture of American empire, which is the continued forced dependence of the global economy on the US dollar. Let me now bring Israel into this analysis properly, because Israel's role in the American imperial system is almost never discussed with the precision it deserves. Israel is consistently framed in American media as either a moral cause, the only democracy in the Middle East, the eternal victim of existential threats, or, among critics, as a rogue state that has captured American foreign policy through lobbying and campaign finance. Both of these framings are inadequate, and both of them obscure the actual structural function that Israel performs within American imperial architecture. Israel is not a rogue actor. Israel is not a tail wagging the dog.
Israel is a forward operating base, the most sophisticated, the most militarily capable, and the most strategically positioned forward operating base the United States has ever maintained in any region of the world. And it operates as such not because of some secret agreement or shadowy conspiracy, but because the interests of Israeli state power and American imperial power have been, for the past 70 years, structurally convergent.
Think about what Israel actually provides to the American system. It provides the most advanced real-world testing environment for American weapon systems on the planet. Every conflict Israel engages in is, from the perspective of Lockheed Martin and Raytheon and General Dynamics, an extraordinarily valuable field trial. The Iron Dome system, jointly developed with American funding, has generated invaluable data on missile interception that feeds directly into American military technology development. The F-35, which Israel was the first export customer to deploy in combat, has been tested in conditions that no American military exercise could replicate. When Israel strikes targets in Syria, in Lebanon, in Gaza, it is simultaneously advancing Israeli strategic objectives and providing the American defense industry with combat performance data worth billions of dollars in research and development savings. This is the transactional reality beneath the humanitarian rhetoric, and it has been the reality for decades. But stay with me here, because the weapons testing dimension, as significant as it is actually the least important structural function Israel performs. The more important function is this: Israel's permanent conflict with its neighbors, and particularly its conflict with Iran and Iran's allied networks across the region, provides the permanent justification for American military presence in the Persian Gulf.
Without a credible Iranian threat, without Hezbollah in Lebanon, without Hamas in Gaza, without the Houthi movement in Yemen, the argument for stationing American carrier groups in the Persian Gulf, for maintaining American bases in Bahrain and Qatar and Kuwait, for the entire forward deployment structure of American military power in the region, becomes much harder to sustain politically. The threat architecture of the Middle East is not incidental to American military presence there. It is the prerequisite for it. And Israel, as the primary antagonist in that threat architecture, is therefore performing an indispensable function in the maintenance of American imperial infrastructure.
Now, I want you to keep this structural logic in mind as I walk you through what the IMF and World Bank have done to the region, because this is the piece of the puzzle that almost never gets discussed in the same conversation as the military dimension. And the failure to connect them is one of the great analytical failures of contemporary political commentary. Keep watching, because what I'm going to show you now is the financial mechanism that completes the circuit. The way military destruction and financial extraction work as a single integrated system, not two separate policies. When a country in the Middle East and North Africa is destabilized through war, through sanctions, through the kind of sustained economic pressure the United States has applied to Iran for 40 years, several things happen in sequence.
First, its currency collapses because sanctions cut it off from dollar-denominated trade finance, and its export revenues collapse. Second, its government faces a fiscal crisis because the tax base shrinks, import costs explode, and the state can no longer fund basic services. Third, and this is the critical step, it becomes dependent on external financing. And the primary vehicle for external financing in these situations is the International Monetary Fund. Now, I have spent a significant portion of my career analyzing what the IMF actually does when it enters a country in crisis. And I want to be very precise about this because the IMF presents itself as a humanitarian rescue institution, and it is nothing of the sort. The IMF is a debt restructuring mechanism that uses temporary liquidity assistance as leverage to impose a structural transformation of the debtor economy in the interests of international creditors, which means overwhelmingly American and European financial institutions.
The conditionalities attached to IMF programs are not economic medicine. They are economic surgery performed without anesthesia and frequently without accurate diagnosis. designed to open the patient's economy to foreign capital penetration. Privatization of state assets, which means selling national infrastructure to foreign investors at distressed prices. Elimination of subsidies, which means removing the price supports on food and energy that allow poor populations to survive, generating social unrest that frequently leads to further political instability. Currency devaluation, which makes the country's labor and resources cheaper for foreign purchasers, while increasing the real burden of dollar-denominated debt. Interest rate increases, which suppress domestic investment and concentrate economic activity in the financial sector rather than in productive industry. I could give you country after country where this playbook has been executed. Egypt.
Jordan, Lebanon, before its complete financial collapse. Iraq after the American occupation, Libya after NATO's intervention. The pattern is so consistent, so precise, and so predictable in its outcomes that to describe it as anything other than deliberate policy requires a level of naivety that I find difficult to sustain. Iran has resisted this trajectory for 45 years, and that resistance is the real source of American hostility toward it, not the nuclear program. Iran signed the JCPOA, submitted to inspections, reduced its enrichment program, and the United States under Trump unilaterally withdrew from the agreement anyway, because the agreement was never really about nuclear weapons. It was about whether Iran could be reintegrated into the dollar system on terms acceptable to American financial power. When it became clear that Iran's reintegration would strengthen rather than weaken its capacity for independent economic development, the agreement was discarded. The nuclear framing was always a pretext. The real negotiation was always about financial sovereignty. What I've been arguing since the 1970s is that the central conflict of the modern world is not between democracy and authoritarianism, not between the West and Islam, not between nuclear powers and non-nuclear powers. The central conflict is between the dollar-centered financial system and every economy that attempts to develop outside of it. And the Middle East is simply the most violent theater in which that conflict is currently being prosecuted.
Now let me turn to the BRICS dynamic in the precise terms it deserves, because I think most commentary on this subject, even sympathetic commentary, dramatically underestimates both what has already happened and what is at stake. The expansion of BRICS in 2023 to include Saudi Arabia, Iran, the UAE, Egypt, and Ethiopia was not a diplomatic curiosity. It was a seismic event in the history of the international monetary system.
For the first time since the Bretton Woods Conference of 1944, there is a coalition of nations that collectively control a majority of the world's proven oil and gas reserves, a majority of the world's rare earth mineral production, a substantial share of global agricultural output, and the world's two largest national economies by purchasing power parity, China and India, that are actively building the institutional infrastructure for a non-dollar trading system. The BRICS New Development Bank, the bilateral currency swap lines that the People's Bank of China has established with over 40 central banks, the M-Bridge project for central bank digital currency settlement, the expansion of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization's economic integration agenda, these are not rhetorical gestures. They are the load-bearing pillars of an alternative financial architecture that is being constructed in real time.
And here's what I want you to understand about why this matters for the Middle East specifically, and why the ceasefire with Iran is a tactical maneuver within a much larger strategic crisis. If Saudi Arabia, the anchor of the petrodollar system since 1974, the country whose pricing decisions effectively determine the dollar denomination of global oil markets, genuinely moves its oil trade into a mixed currency framework that includes substantial yuan settlement, the petrodollar architecture does not gradually weaken. It breaks. Not overnight, not in a single dramatic moment, but the structural logic that forces every oil importing economy to maintain dollar reserves collapses. And with it collapses the mechanism by which the United States has been able to finance its military spending, its trade deficits, and its domestic consumption by issuing debt that the rest of the world is compelled to hold. The numbers here are worth stating precisely. The United States currently runs a current account deficit of roughly $900 billion per year. It finances that deficit by issuing treasury bonds. Foreign central banks and sovereign wealth funds hold approximately $7 trillion of US Treasury securities. That stock of foreign-held Treasury debt is the accumulated subsidy that the rest of the world has provided to American consumption and military spending over the past 50 years. If the structural incentive to hold dollar reserves diminishes, if oil can be bought in yuan or in a BRICS settlement currency, then the demand for Treasury bonds diminishes, interest rates rise, the cost of financing American government debt rises, and the entire model of American imperial finance begins to unravel. This is not a distant theoretical possibility.
This is the proximate financial crisis that American policy in the Middle East is designed to prevent or at least delay.
Now, here is where I want to bring the domestic American political economy into the picture, because I think it is essential to understand who benefits from the continuation of the system, and therefore who will fight to preserve it regardless of the humanitarian cost. The American defense industry, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, which is now RTX, Northrop Grumman, General Dynamics, Boeing Defense, collectively employs hundreds of thousands of workers in congressional districts across every major state in the Union. Their combined annual revenues exceed $300 billion.
Their lobbying expenditures, their campaign contributions, their revolving door relationships with the Pentagon and the State Department constitute one of the most effective influence operations in the history of democratic politics. When I say that Congress cannot seriously debate ending American military involvement in the Middle East, I do not mean that individual congressmen lack the courage, though many of them do. I mean that the structural incentives of the American political funding system make a sustained anti-interventionist majority in Congress essentially impossible to assemble. The defense industry has not just captured the policy process, it has made the policy process financially dependent on its continued growth. But the defense industry is only one node in the network of American institutions that benefit from Middle East instability. The financial sector benefits because dollar hegemony is the foundation of Wall Street's global dominance. American banks, JP Morgan Chase, Citigroup, Goldman Sachs, are not simply domestic financial institutions that happen to operate internationally. They are the operational mechanism of dollar hegemony. They provide the trade finance, the correspondent banking relationships, the derivatives markets, the bond underwriting that make the dollar system function as a global system. If dollar hegemony weakens, the competitive advantage of American financial institutions weakens with it. The energy sector benefits because the American fracking industry, which made the United States the world's largest oil producer, depends on oil prices remaining high enough to make shale extraction profitable. And Middle East instability is one of the most reliable mechanisms for keeping oil prices elevated. The bond market benefits because as long as there is no alternative to treasury bonds as the world's reserve asset, the United States can finance its debt at interest rates far below what its fiscal position would otherwise justify. These are not separate groups with separate interests that happen to align. They are an integrated financial, military, industrial complex. And I use that phrase with full awareness of its Eisenhower origins, that has a unified structural interest in the continuation of a system that transfers wealth from the rest of the world to the American financial elite. The Middle East is not a problem for this system. The Middle East is a profit center. And this brings me to the global South and to the question of what all of this means for the billions of people who live outside the charmed circle of dollar system beneficiaries. What it means is this: every dollar of debt that a developing country owes to the IMF or to dollar-denominated bond markets is a dollar of surplus that is being extracted from that country's labor and resources and transferred to American and European financial institutions. Every arms sale to a Gulf state is a dollar of productive investment that does not go into schools, hospitals, water systems, or agricultural development. Every sanction regime imposed on an economy that tries to develop outside the dollar system is a deliberate impoverishment of a population in order to make a political point. The humanitarian catastrophe of the Middle East, the refugees, the destroyed cities, the shattered public health systems, the generations of children growing up in rubble, is not the unfortunate byproduct of a security policy gone wrong. It is the direct, predictable, and in many cases intended consequence of a financial architecture designed to prevent independent economic development in regions that sit atop resources or trade routes the dollar system needs to control. I have been making this argument in various forms for over 50 years. In Super Imperialism, I showed how the dollar treasury bill standard worked as a mechanism of financial extraction. In The Destiny of Civilization, I showed how the choice between finance capitalism and industrial capitalism was the defining geopolitical fault line of the 21st century. What is happening now in Iran, in Gaza, in the broader Middle East, is the violent terminal phase of a system that is losing its grip on the global economy and is responding to that loss of grip with escalating military force, escalating sanctions, and escalating propaganda, including, most recently, the propaganda of a ceasefire that was never intended to hold and was designed from the outset to provide diplomatic cover for the next phase of the campaign.
Here is what I want you to take away from this analysis, not as a counsel of despair, but as a map for understanding what is actually happening, and therefore what resistance to it actually requires. The dollar system is weakening. That is not a prediction. That is a description of a process already underway, measurable in the declining share of global trade settled in dollars, in the accumulating bilateral currency agreements that bypass dollar intermediation, in the growing gold purchases by central banks that are quietly reducing their dollar reserve exposure. The question is not whether the petrodollar architecture will eventually give way to something more multipolar. The question is, how much destruction will be inflicted on how many populations in the attempt to delay that transition?
The ceasefire with Iran, when it is eventually announced with appropriate fanfare, will be described as a triumph of American diplomacy. The media will cover the handshakes and the carefully worded communiques. The think tanks will produce analyses about the moderation of Iranian behavior and the effectiveness of sanctions pressure. None of that will be the real story. The real story will be what was agreed in the financial and energy domain, which agreements will not be made public, which countries' oil revenues will flow through which currency channels, and whether Iran's integration into the BRICS economic architecture will be slowed, accelerated, or simply continued regardless of whatever diplomatic theater is performed for public consumption. What I've spent 50 years trying to do is give people the analytical tools to read past the theater and see the mechanism. The mechanism is always financial. The military is always in service of the financial. And the populations who pay the price in Gaza, in Tehran, in Baghdad, in Tripoli, in Sana'a, and increasingly in the American cities where the cost of empire is paid in decaying infrastructure and defunded public services, are always the ones who were never consulted about whether this system should exist in the first place. That is the war that is actually being fought. And until the people who are paying for it understand it clearly enough to name it precisely, the people who are profiting from it will continue to operate without serious challenge. That is why this analysis matters. That is why getting it right is not an academic exercise. It is the most urgent political task of our time.